Pacific Glade is a quiet town, mostly. That's one of the perks of living so far away from everyone else. It's the kind of place where you'd let your kids wander long after the sun goes down, a place where you don't mind animals coming out of the forest to nuzzle your heels and beg for scraps. We get next to zero tourism. Some people joke that we should call it the Neverglades. We're that blip on the map you'd never notice unless you were driving through. The whole town could disappear from the face of the earth one day, and the rest of the world would never notice our absence. If you spent most of your life here, like me, you grow used to its idiosyncrasies. Take the weather. We've had hailstorms in July, and hot December nights that would make you want to jump headfirst into Lake Lucid. The woods make noises too. The usual hoots and howls, of course, but sometimes when it's late, you can hear these strange scraping sounds from the trees that make the fillings in your teeth tingle. And let's not forget that summer when every single chicken in the glade vanished overnight. They never found a trace of those critters, not even a single feather left behind. Par for the course for the average citizen. But when you work here as a homicide detective, you notice other things. Bodies with unexplained wounds and markings. Trails that lead nowhere. Pieces that don't quite fit together, no matter how much you turn them. Eventually you have to accept that not all cases can be solved. It's a shitty feeling, but that's reality for you. Some killers never get caught. Some deaths have no satisfying explanation. You take the good cases with the bad and hope you leave the world at least a little better than you found it. The case that changed everything for me started out no different from all the others. I was driving down the highway in my police cruiser, flipping through stations on the dash, when Olivia Marconi's voice came crackling over my comm radio. "You there, Mark?" she said. "We've got a suspicious death at the gas station on Minnow Street. This one's got your department written all over it." I brought the radio up to my mouth. "Be there in a sec," I said. "Try and keep the body warm for me." "Just get over here, asshole." I could usually tell when Marconi was messing with me, but there was no smirk in her voice this time. That didn't bode well. My smile fading, I stepped on the gas and rocketed down the highway toward the center of town. No matter where you go in the glade, drive far enough and you'll find yourself surrounded by trees. And not just any trees. I'm talking a full-blown forest with twisted branches and canopies that make everything dark as night, even in mid-afternoon. The nearest town is a 20-minute drive through acres of wilderness. I remember growing up and hearing stories from the other kids, that the stuff we saw on TV was all propaganda, that there was nothing more to the world except an endless forest that branched out in all directions and swallowed up the horizon. Pretty morbid for a bunch of kids. But then again, kids are pretty morbid. I would know. I've got two of my own. It was getting late when I finally pulled up to the Minnow Street gas station, and the darkening treetops flashed with spirals of red and blue. The lot was absolutely packed with cruisers. Parking further down the street, I stepped out of my car and crossed the lot to slip underneath the police tape. Sheriff Marconi was speaking to a boy in a red cashier vest when I walked in. He couldn't have been more than 16. His skin was slick with sweat and he wouldn't stop fidgeting. He kept wringing his hands together and wiping them on the sides of his pants in a constant agitated motion. When Marconi saw me enter, she placed a hand on the boy's shoulder and said something too quiet for me to hear. She left him alone with his private trauma and came over to join me by the door. "Poor kid's scared out of his wits," she said under her breath. "I don't blame him. This one's a doozy, Mark. They've even got a federal agent investigating the case." "Seriously?" I asked. That was fast. I craned my neck, but the shelves were swarming with cops. I couldn't make out any unfamiliar faces. She shrugged. "Must have had somebody in the area already. He got her just a couple minutes after we did." "I'll go see what he's up to," I said. "Maybe he spotted something our guys have missed." "Be my guest," she grimaced. "But brace yourself, Mark. It's not pretty over there." I tipped her a quick salute and worked my way through the aisles, heading toward the scene of the crime. It wasn't hard to find. Cops were streaming in and out of the shelves, ushering curious spectators away and trying to stifle the overall panic from the other customers. I pushed through the mob and found myself staring down at a hopelessly mangled body. There was something unnatural about the way he was sprawled out on the floor. Something disjointed and almost a little spidery. I recognized the federal agent right away. He would have stood out in any crowd. Easily 7 feet tall and slender as a pole, he loomed over the other cops like a statue. Everything about him was gray. Fedora, trench coat, even the pallid color of his skin. The smoldering tip of a cigar protruded from his teeth. He turned to face me as I approached. His eyes were a strange shade of purple that I'd never seen before. They seemed to spin under the overhead lights. Hi, I said, holding out my hand. Detective Mark Hannigan. Nice to meet you. The tall figure stared at my outstretched hand for a few seconds, then shook it. Same to you, he said. His voice had a gravelly quality, like his throat was coated with pebbles. Thin wisps of smoke escaped from his teeth and billowed around the end of his cigar. What should I call you? I asked after a few seconds of silence. For now, Inspector is fine, he said. But don't mind me. What are your thoughts on our friend here? I leaned down and examined the body. The man's face was hanging in flaps, jagged red streaks that had already begun to fester. The stench was something awful. His nose had disintegrated into a mass of gore and bone. The limbs sprawled across the tiles, bent backwards at impossible angles. In a few places, chunks of blood-stained bone jutted through the skin. I'd seen some pretty grisly stuff on the force before, but this took the cake. Bile churned in my throat, and I withdrew quickly from the body. Do we have an ID on the Vic yet? I asked. His license says Edgar Guerrera, although it's hard to tell if he's the man in the picture. His face is too disfigured. The inspector knelt down and traced the tiles around the body with one bony finger. He drew it back and rubbed his fingers together. A fine stream of shiny powder trickled to the floor. I frowned. Is that glass? I think so, he replied. He rose to his feet, brushing the powder off his coat. Look at the way the body's slumped. The lacerations, the broken bones. It's almost as though he went straight through a windshield. But that's crazy, I said. There's blood everywhere, sure, but no footprints or drag marks. If this was really a car accident, he either staggered in here after the fact, or somebody else lugged him in. Maybe, the inspector said. But why go through all that effort? Whoever did this didn't even try to hide the body. He flicked some ash toward the crime scene. The body was splayed out across the tiles, limbs spread wide like a human starfish. Blood glistened in puddles under the sickly fluorescent lights. It was messy and gory and awfully conspicuous. Whoever did this wanted the body to be found. What is it? Some kind of warning? I asked. The inspector gazed down at the body. It's possible. Of course, that's assuming this was murder, that someone left the body here intentionally. If this was just a freak accident, then we've got an entirely different situation on our hands. And that worries me. I'm not sure I follow you, Inspector, I said. But he didn't elaborate. He kept staring down at the body, purple eyes spinning, lost in thought. Shrugging, I took out my phone and snapped a few photos, trying to capture the scene from every angle. Marconi and I could get a closer look once I got the pictures back to headquarters. All the while, the inspector stood utterly still. If it weren't for the curls of steamy breath escaping from around his cigar, I might have mistaken him for a statue after all. Marconi was leaning against her cruiser when I left the store. I watched as she pulled a stick of gum from her pocket and brought it up to her mouth like a cigarette. Marconi had quit smoking a month ago and had taken up chewing gum as a substitute. I almost never saw her without a wad in her mouth. She said it helped her relax, and who was I to judge? I walked over and joined her by the cruiser. What did the kid say? She snapped the gum in the back of her cheek. He was shelving some cereal boxes when he heard this loud crumpling sound, like someone crushing a really big can of soda. He went over to the next aisle to check it out and found our friend Mr. Guerrero just lying there. Said he screamed for a few seconds before running to the bathroom to puke. His story checks out with a few customers we could get to talk about it. Sounds like it happened in a matter of seconds, I said. But how is that possible? Guy looks like he's been in a car crash. No one gets that mangled that quickly, let alone in a fucking gas station. Marconi turned her head and stared at the convenience store doors. The inspector had just wandered outside, cigar tips still smoldering. He shoved his hands in his trench coat pockets and strode off down the sidewalk. His stride was strange. His body didn't rise and fall with each step. It stayed completely level, as if he was gliding along the ground. I watched the steady glow of his cigar as he turned the corner and disappeared from view. "What did you think of that guy?" Marconi asked. "I only talked to him for a few seconds, but he gave me the creeps." "He's definitely something," I said. I craned my neck, but the inspector was long gone. Never seen anybody quite like him. Not a bad detective, though. Marconi gnawed on her gum for a few pensive seconds. "Well, I hope we wrap up this case quick," she said. "I'll rest easier when the feds are off our backs." She spat the wad back into her hand and folded it into the empty wrapper. I stood back as she opened the cruiser door and hopped into the driver's seat. Before she left, she rolled down the window and gave me the dimmest of smiles. "See you back at the station," she said. Then she revved the engine and rolled backwards out of the parking lot. The coroner's office confirmed what we'd already suspected. The victim's wounds were consistent with those of a car crash. It wasn't the lacerations or the broken bones that had killed him. It was blunt force trauma to the head. That explained the mangled mess of his nose. What it didn't explain was how a car crash victim had ended up sprawled on the floor of a convenience store. The security footage wasn't much help. It showed Edgar Guerrero entering the store and browsing the shelves, but after a few minutes the camera went on the fritz and grew riddled with static. By the time he came back into focus, Edgar was dead. Sabotage? Had someone messed with the security cameras to conceal their involvement in his death? Nothing seemed to make any sense, and trying to find meaning in this case had me working late into the hours of the night. My wife, Ruth, called me a few times to make sure I was okay. I couldn't tell her too much about the case for obvious reasons, but Ruth was perceptive. She'd seen a couple of my cases on the news, and she knew how dark these things could get. I promised her I was fine and that I'd be home within the next few hours. She didn't quite sound convinced, but said she'd leave dinner in the fridge for whenever I got back. My investigation into the life of Edgar Guerrero brought up zilch. He worked at a car repair workshop down in the lower glade and doubled as the night janitor at Pacific High. He had a wife and 2 daughters and went to church with his family on Sundays. I couldn't figure out why anyone would want to kill this guy. He was as vanilla as they come. He had no obvious enemies, nobody who harbored enough of a grudge to murder him in such a gory, invisible way. Unless the inspector was right and this was somehow a freak accident. Which left us where? That line of reasoning made even less sense than the murder theory. By morning, I was a walking headache, and it only got worse when news of another dead body came over the police channel. The officer seemed reluctant to describe the details, which could only mean one thing. This was a gory one. I thought back to the mangled mess of Edgar Guerrero's body and wondered what kind of fresh horror they'd stumbled onto this time. There was no point in putting this off until later. Grabbing my jacket, I headed out the door and climbed into my cruiser. The body had been found on the front porch of a house in the lower glade, down by Spokane Falls. The few details I could get over the radio were maddeningly vague. All I gathered was that the victim was young and female. However she had died, it was too gruesome to announce over the airwaves. I stepped on the gas and urged my car to go a little faster. The victim's house was a pretty little number. White fences, low-hanging eaves, a front yard laden with flowers of all colors. The falls crashed like pistons in the background. I drove up the driveway, talked for a bit with the officers on duty, then got out of my car to investigate the scene. I pulled on a set of latex gloves as I did so. A pair of cops were standing together and muttering to one another by the front porch. They stepped aside warily to let me through. The porch reeked of rotten body smell, and I had to hold a hand over my mouth and nose before I dared to go any closer. The victim was a blonde-haired girl in her late 20s or so. The entire left side of her body had collapsed into a splattery mess of gore that spread outward in all directions. One green eye still stared blankly into the distance. I knelt down, surveying the splintery remains of her limbs for anything out of the ordinary. It was difficult. My eyes were swimming, and I had to fight back the urge to retch. When I looked up again, the inspector was slouched in the doorway. His fedora was pulled low, and his face was framed by a halo of smoke. That damn cigar again. It was like an extension of his body. I almost couldn't imagine him without it. "Did the feds send you down here?" I asked. "They can't possibly think there's a link between these cases. I mean, aside from their sheer weirdness." "I go where I'm needed," he said. "Right now, I'm needed here." It didn't sound like he was going to offer anything more, so I stood up and began peeling off my latex gloves. The officers who got here first said her name was Vivian Tracy. A couple of them actually knew her from around town. She volunteered down at the soup pantry and ran a reading group at the public library. Bright kid. Her neighbor was the one to phone us about the body. Said she was walking home from the supermarket and just saw Vivian lying there. She didn't get close enough to see the gorier details, but it sounds like she saw enough. The inspector nodded. "Do we know anything about the neighbor?" "Not much. She's getting on in years, so she likes walking to the store to get some exercise. Apparently she didn't know Vivian all that well, but she said she seemed like a nice enough girl. Not the kind of person someone would want to murder." "Just like Mr. Guerrera," the inspector said quietly. It sounded like he'd done some research of his own. I cast another glance at the body. "If this even was murder," I said. I'd seen suicides leap from buildings before. I'd watched medics scrape viscera off the sidewalk. There was no doubt in my mind that Vivian Tracy had fallen to her death. But how is that possible? The porch roof overhead was still intact. She obviously hadn't come crashing through it. And there was no way our would-be murderer could have dragged the body here. The splatter made it all too clear that this was the point of impact. "What the hell is going on here?" I muttered. The inspector leaned down and tilted what remained of Vivian's arm with one gloved hand. Her skin was streaked with blotchy green patches. It reminded me of the grass stains my sons got on their knees after soccer practice. "Is that significant?" I asked him. "Everything's significant," he replied, straightening up. "You should know that by now." Smoke trailed from his cigar in slow, almost thoughtful spirals. My head was starting to throb again, and the insistent crashing of Spokane Falls wasn't doing much to help. I rubbed my aching temple. It had been a long day and a half. Maybe things would start making more sense if I went home and recharged my batteries. It was around 3 a.m. when the cell phone on my dresser began to buzz. I've always been a light sleeper, which is lucky for a detective. You never know when you need to be on your feet in a hurry. I fumbled for the phone and brought it up to my ear. "This is Detective Hannigan," I said, keeping my voice to a whisper. Ruth was fast asleep next to me, and I didn't want to wake her. "It's me," said the voice on the other end of the line. The inspector? The connection didn't muffle his voice, which created the unsettling illusion that he was crouching by the bedside, speaking directly into my ear. I rubbed my eyes and peered around the bedroom, just to be on the safe side. "How did you get this number?" I mumbled. The inspector either didn't hear me or chose not to answer. "I've been doing research down at the station, and I may have picked up a lead on the Tracy and Guerrera deaths," he said. "Could you head to the Skokomish Bluffs area to do some recon?" I squinted at the clock on my desk. "I'm off duty, Inspector. Are you sure you can't ask one of the other officers? I'm pretty sure Marconi's out patrolling right now." "No, it needs to be you, Mark," he replied. "Call me when you're on the road, and I'll give you the specifics." Hang on, Damn it. The man didn't leave much room for conversation. I stared at the glowing screen of my phone for a few seconds, before sighing and placing it down again. Ruth's eyes were open when I turned to get out of bed. They glittered a little in the light from the window. "Duty calls?" she asked. She drew back the covers a few inches and began to knead the fabric with her right hand. The moon dappled her bare skin with the shadows of leafy branches. I leaned over and kissed her gently on the forehead. "I won't be gone long," I promised. She surveyed me, silent, her eyes refusing to give away what she was thinking. "Just stay safe," she said at last. I told her I would and slipped out of bed, grabbing my jacket from the bedpost and tripping hastily into a pair of work boots. I called the inspector as I headed outside and fumbled through my jacket pockets for the keys to my Camaro. "Okay, I'm here," I said. "Tell me what you've got." Both victims had ties to a high school teacher named Ellery Pickett, he replied in that strangely crisp voice. I glanced around again before slipping into the driver's seat. "He's a botanist, teaches environmental science at the school where Edgar did his janitorial work. He's also a head volunteer at the youth group Vivian Tracy attended up until her death." I paused, waiting for more. "That's it?" I asked. "You got me out of bed for a connection this flimsy? I'm sorry, Inspector, but there's nothing to even remotely suggest that this is a lead. People know other people. It's not so unusual for both Vics to have mutual friends in a town this size." The inspector let out an exasperated noise that I can only describe as a hiss. "But that's the thing," he said. "They don't have anyone in common. I checked as many sources as I could, and as far as I can tell, Ellery is the only link between our victims. Plus, Ellery himself seems to have dropped off the radar. He hasn't shown up at school for the past week, and nobody has seen him around town since then. He's holed up in his house doing God knows what. That's why I want you to do a little snooping. Scope out his home and see if he's up to anything suspicious." I sighed. "Fine, I'll humor you on this one. But you'd better be onto something here." The voice at the end of the line was quiet for a few moments. "I don't know if you believe in intuition, Mark, but every nerve in my body went on edge when that man's name came up in the database. One way or another, he's involved with this, and I intend to find out how." He gave me Ellery's address and hung up before I could get another word in. A real talker, that one. I shook my head, turned the wheel, and headed down the back roads that would take me all the way to Skokomish Bluffs. When I was a kid, the Bluffs had a reputation for being haunted. Indian burial grounds and such, you know how it is. But mostly the Bluffs were just quiet. We almost never had disturbances this far out of town. The few people who lived here kept to themselves, and so did the animals who poked their heads out of the forest from time to time. This was off near the edge of the glade, where you couldn't walk 10 feet without stumbling into a line of trees. The view from the top of the bluffs was stunning. During my younger years, I used to come out here with my friends and watch the setting sun sink beneath the line of treetops. It made the entire forest look like it had gone up in softly burning flames. I drove through a couple acres of wilderness before the ground sloped upward and the trees gave way to a grassy emptiness. The road beneath my tires was more dirt than pavement. From time to time, the occasional house would rise from the landscape and flit past my side window. Most of them had seen better days. Grimy, warped wood that glistened in the moonlight and shutters hanging askew. That sort of stuff. A few lone cattle drifted through the fields, nibbling aimlessly at the grass. It wasn't hard to find Ellery's house. The place was in much better shape than the houses I'd seen before, and there was a massive greenhouse sprouting from the back that seemed to teeter on the edge of the bluffs. Hadn't the inspector said Ellery was a botanist? I parked my car in a nearby thicket and cut the engine, my headlights fading. Then I settled back into the driver's seat and waited. What was I waiting for? I didn't have a clue. The likelihood that Ellery would be awake at this hour, let alone doing anything suspicious, was close to nil. But the inspector had been insistent on me coming here, so I figured I owed him the benefit of the doubt. I kicked my feet up on the dashboard and stared at the empty windows, watching for any signs of movement. Around 4:15, the front door opened suddenly, and I froze where I was sitting. An elderly man with feathery white hair came limping onto the front porch. Ellery? He looked older than I'd expected. I followed him as he hobbled over to the porch swing and eased into it with a visible wheeze of breath. I sank deeper in my seat and dialed the inspector from my cell. Anything? He asked right away. I'm at Ellery's house, and he just walked onto the front porch, I said under my breath. It's a little late for him to be out, don't you think? Especially someone his age. I could practically see the inspector wrinkling his brow. His age? What do you mean? I mean he's seriously old. Old enough to be my grandfather. I don't know, Inspector. Seems like you might have made the wrong call on this one. There was a sharp intake of breath from the other end of the line. Don't go anywhere near him, the inspector said. His voice, usually so collected, now bordered on frantic. Shit, this is bad. You need to get back to the station now. I peered through the front window again. Ellery was drifting lazily on the porch swing, hair floating about his head like wisps of white cotton candy. He's an old man, Inspector. He practically had a heart attack just walking across his porch. How could he possibly be dangerous? That's no old man, the inspector insisted. Trust me, if that thing gets its hands on you, it's all over. You need to get out of there. Ellery jerked his head up suddenly, as if he could hear the inspector's gravelly voice from all the way across the lawn. His swing froze in place. I tried to crouch beneath the dashboard as his eyes darted back and forth. I didn't think he could see my car from here, but those eyes seemed remarkably sharp for someone his age, and I couldn't shake the sense that they could see in the darkness. They reminded me of the time I'd taken a hiking trip with my friends up in Catamount State Forest. We'd seen an actual cougar prowling the rocks on the cliff over from ours, its eyes glowing yellow in the light from the moon. If it could have leaped the gap and devoured us, I'm sure it would have. That was the look I saw in Ellery's eyes. I'll meet you back at the station, I whispered into the phone. Ellery sat there for a few more minutes, peering into the night, before he pried himself from the porch swing and shuffled back into the house. I didn't waste any time getting out of there. I started the engines as quietly as I could and pulled away from the thicket, leaving trails of trampled leaves behind me. Before long, I was out of the bluffs and zooming down the streets toward the police station. The trees loomed like sentinels around me, and for the first time in a very long while, I was thankful for their cover. The inspector was waiting by my desk when I finally got back to the station. He had a stack of papers in his hands that he kept flipping through. What's all that? I asked. He glanced up, startled, as if he hadn't heard me come in. I've been looking through my research, and I found a disturbing link between the victims, he said. He handed me the papers and stabbed at the first source, so hard his finger almost poked through it. Look at this article. Edgar Guerrero was involved in a car accident 8 years ago that nearly killed him. It was a 4-car pile-up. The paper says he would have gone through the windshield on impact if he hadn't been wearing his seatbelt. And look at this. He shifted the papers and showed me a grayscale printout. It's a blog post from Vivian Tracy. Apparently she was skydiving with her college roommate last summer when she had a close call with a ripcord. Her parachute almost didn't open. A few more seconds and she would have hit the ground, full force. I glanced through the inspector's sources. The newspaper didn't say much about Edgar's car crash, but the vehicles in the picture had been crumpled like used soda cans, and I had a hard time imagining anyone walking away from this one. The post from Vivian's blog was cheery and riddled with emoticons. There was a photograph of her plummeting through the air, laughing, with a stretch of grassy ground waiting far below to meet her. The girl in this picture had no idea how close she would come to dying. I thought of her body, splattered in a puddle on the front porch, and an unpleasant tingle crawled over my skin. This can't be coincidental, I agreed, handing back the files. But what do these sources have to do with Ellery Pickett? The inspector reached for the desk and withdrew another sheet of printer paper. This is a license renewal, issued to Mr. Pickett just last year. He passed it to me, his fingers taut. The license was newly issued, just as the inspector had said, but the figure in the photo was far too young to be Ellery. That's not to say there wasn't a resemblance. His nose had the same crooked bent to it, and his stringy black hair was already starting to thin. I could imagine it growing white and wispy in several years' time. "This guy's only 40 years old," I said, looking up from the paper. "The old man I saw on Ellery's porch must have been his father or something. There's no way a person could age that much in the course of 1 year." The inspector snapped his fingers. "But that's just it. Ellery has aged. Several decades in a matter of months. I knew what we were dealing with the second you described him to me. There's something inside him. Something that's been eating away his years until he became that dried-up husk you saw." I furrowed my brow. "You want to run that by me again?" The inspector began to pace in agitated circles. "You don't have a word for what this thing is. Let's just call it a time eater. It's messing around in the past, turning these people's near-death experiences into real death experiences." Whoa, slow down," I said. "What are you saying?" The inspector stopped his pacing. "This entity doesn't perceive time the same way you do. It's not a linear progression. It's like a piece of latticework, a series of avenues that go forward and backward and sideways in all directions." He tried to gesture with his hands, but gave up. "This thing is reaching back in time and tweaking little details, an unbuckled seatbelt, a faulty parachute pull cord, so that our victims die years before they should have. The past tries to catch up to the present, and wham, instant death. The time meter takes those missing years and feeds on them. That's how it stays alive. It's like a parasite, leeching the life force out of others." "Okay, hold up," I said. "I don't quite understand what you're talking about, but do you hear how crazy you sound? I agree that whatever's happening here is weird, but you can't just go around inventing monsters that fill in all the blanks. There's a perfectly rational answer to all this, and we'll find it. Just give us time." "We don't have time. Didn't you hear me? This thing feeds on time." He rubbed his cheek hastily, clouds of dense smoke billowing from his mouth. "I know you don't believe me yet, but this is your answer, Mark. So grab your car and let's go. We need to stop Ellery before he feeds again." He slammed the papers onto my desk and strode to the door, his trench coat whipping behind him. I glanced down at the wrinkled stack of files. Ellery's impassive face stared up at me, his dark eyes blank and unreadable. I wasn't ready to buy into the inspector's time eater theory just yet. But what was it Sherlock Holmes said? When you have eliminated the impossible, whatever remains, however improbable, must be the truth. Ellery Pickett might not have been a time-eating monster from outer space, but he was a common link in both of our mysterious death cases, and he may have played some sort of role in the murders. It was worth a look at least. I must be insane, I mumbled to myself, but I followed the inspector out of the station, making sure to turn the lights off behind me. Marconi wasn't too happy to leave her patrol at this hour of the night, but I told her that we had a lead in the mysterious deaths, however tenuous, and the inspector had requested backup just in case. I trusted Marconi. She was a hell of a shot, and she excelled under pressure. I'd witnessed her handle bomb threats and lines of incessant gunfire without breaking a sweat. It wouldn't be an exaggeration to say she'd saved my life a few times over. There was no one I wanted more on the force to watch our backs. She met us in the heart of Skokomish Bluffs, her headlights off and her engine reduced to a low thrum. It wasn't an unusual sound to hear this far into the wilderness. It could have easily been the purr of a mountain cat. Ellery's house waited for us at the top of the bluffs, tiny as an architect's model from where we were standing. The dim moonlight glimmered off his greenhouse. Marconi glanced up at it, then back at us. "You boys want to tell me what you're doing in the ass crack of nowhere?" she asked. "Just stay here and keep an eye on the place," the inspector said. "If you hear any sort of commotion, grab your gun and follow us immediately. Don't hesitate to shoot if necessary." "Sorry to drag you into this," I said, putting one hand on the hood of her cruiser. "It should just be a simple Q&A, but the inspector's getting kind of paranoid, given how extreme these cases have gotten." The bluffs were quiet for a few moments, An owl hooted in some distant tree. "I seriously appreciate you coming out here, you know." "All right, but you owe me," she replied. The smile that flickered on her face was almost a smirk, but it settled into something softer. I gave her a weak salute and turned to join the inspector. We kept to the shadows as we ascended the hill toward Ellery's house. "Keep your gun ready," the inspector said under his breath. I hesitated. This was supposed to be a peaceful investigation, but he sounded so earnest that I slipped my pistol out of its holster. I gripped it with both hands, the metal cold under my fingers. It felt heavier than usual. Maybe there was something in the air out here. The building couldn't have been more than one story, but it loomed over us as we approached. We climbed onto the front porch with hesitant footsteps. A gust of wind picked up, causing the porch swing to drift lazily back and forth. I reached out to ring the doorbell, but the inspector stopped my hand. The front door was open just a crack, revealing a dark foyer with a welcome mat and a dried potted plant. He gestured for us to go inside. "We don't have a warrant," I hissed. "Are you crazy?" "Trust me, a warrant is the least of our worries," he replied. He ducked his head and slipped across the threshold. Swearing under my breath, I held up my gun and followed him into the dark entrance hall. I nearly stumbled over another flower pot in the process. They were strewn everywhere along the rug, roots upended, dirt spilling out in clumps. The inspector reached down and picked up one of the fallen leaves. It was gray and crispy, and it crumbled into dust at his touch. "The time eater's been feeding," he said quietly. "It must have sucked all the juice out of Ellery's plants before moving on to humans. But even that's not enough. Its vessel is aging faster than it can feed." "If you're done speaking gibberish, can we get a move on here?" I whispered. Jesus, this was so illegal in so many ways. Ellery could sue the shit out of us for entering his house without a warrant. I wasn't exactly sure what the inspector was trying to accomplish here. A ceramic clatter issued from the back of the house, and the inspector froze. "The greenhouse," he said. He rose from his crouched position and darted through the doorway, his slender body disappearing in the darkness of the next room. I gritted my teeth and raced after him. The kitchen was already empty when I stepped inside. Where the hell had he run off to? Another clatter came from deeper in the house, louder this time. It sounded like someone had thrown a flower pot onto the ground. I dodged past the kitchen table, overflowing with empty plates and silverware, before ducking into a side hallway and heading toward the greenhouse. The door had already been thrown open for me, so I hurried inside. Everything had an eerie silver tint in the moonlight. Plots of earth stood on raised platforms, dried ferns and withered flowers slumping in piles on the soil. Flower pots were perched on every spare inch of shelf space. I spun in a slow circle, keeping my gun held up, eyes peeled for any sign of movement. I couldn't tell where the crash had come from. There was no ceramic littering the ground, no splatter of roots and dirt. My shoes made light tapping noises on the linoleum as I made my cautious way to the back of the greenhouse. Then a hunched shape came lunging at me from behind one of the raised platforms, fingers bared like claws. Ellery? His head was thrown back, and his wispy hair fluttered behind him as he ran. A guttural cry rose in his throat and pierced my ears. Without thinking, I raised my gun and fired off a single shot. Ellery veered out of the way with almost inhuman agility, moving far faster than any man his age should be able to. Then he crashed into me, knocking me against the glass cabinet and latching onto my arm with one clawed fist. I cried out. My gun flew from my hand and skittered away across the greenhouse floor. Veins popped under his grip, glowing in lines of neon red beneath my skin. The same red glow pulsed from his open mouth. At first I thought his teeth were missing, but no, it was more than that. The space between his jaws had been completely hollowed out. No gums, no tongue, no esophagus. Just a gaping maw where his mouth should be. I kicked at his shins and tried to struggle free, but his grip was stronger than I would have expected from an old man. If he even was an old man anymore. His eyes had taken on an odd silver sheen, like he was wearing mirrored contact lenses. A tangled sort of snarl escaped from the void that was his throat. His grip tightened, and suddenly my brain was flooded with images. At first they were just flashes. Memories that zipped past me with a crackle and a burst of static. But eventually they took on a stuttering sense of cohesion, like a film reel spinning. I recognized this night. It must have been 3 years ago, when I was still new to the force. I saw myself crouched behind my police cruiser, gun clenched in one sweaty hand, listening as bullets whistled past the car and shattered somebody's windshield. Red and blue lights spun in circles around me. When the firing stopped, I lunged up and aimed my gun at the shooter, shouting orders to surrender. The bullet caught me in the chest before I could even finish speaking. It knocked the wind out of me and sent me sprawling on my back. If it hadn't been for the Kevlar vest I was wearing, I would have died that night. The bullet had stopped just inches from my heart. Except this memory was different. As Ellery squeezed my arm, the Kevlar began to disintegrate beneath my uniform, shriveling away as if it had never been there in the first place. Maybe it hadn't. This was my missing seatbelt, my faulty ripcord. Ellery was erasing the safety blanket from my past. As the Kevlar shrank away, I could feel the bullet resuming its suspended course, burrowing through my shirt and sinking its cold metal body into the flesh above my heart. Then the inspector burst out of nowhere, barreled into the old man, and sent him crashing to the floor of the greenhouse. His fingers detached from my skin with a strange wet sucking sound. The memory of my night in the crossfire jerked backward like the sensation of an elastic snapping, and I collapsed against the glass cabinet. It came crashing down on the pots of dead flowers. I drew in a shuddering gasp of air and tried to regain my balance. The memory of the bullet still burned against my chest, but my shirt was dry, and I didn't think it had pierced the skin. I could have been a bit woozy from Ellery messing with my mind, but as I staggered to my feet, I thought I saw the old man pick up the inspector and hurl him through the back wall of the greenhouse. His body smashed through with enough force to make the glass explode outward in a shower of tiny shards. Ellery leaped through the gaping hole and threw himself on top of the inspector. I got down on my knees and began scrambling through the mess of soil and broken glass, searching for my fallen gun. My vision was swimmy, and I had to stop a few times to keep myself from keeling over out of dizziness, but I kept moving. I'd seen what Ellery, or the thing inside Ellery, was capable of. I had to stop him before he got his hands on the inspector, too. At last my fingers closed around a familiar metal handle, and I got shakily to my feet, gun in hand. I stumbled through the jagged hole and back into the fray. The stretch of grass behind the greenhouse couldn't have been longer than 20 or 30 feet. Beyond that was a dizzying drop into the wilderness. The inspector grappled with Ellery, cigar still clenched beneath his teeth. The smoke that billowed from his lips had turned a dusky shade of red. As they fought, they staggered farther and farther backwards in an effort to drive the other one over the edge. Ellery scrabbled at the inspector's arm, trying to sink his claws in and start the whole time-eating process all over again. But as strong as he was, the inspector was stronger. He moved too fast for my delirious eyes to follow, his trench coat whipping behind him like the wings of some avenging angel. I aimed my pistol at the pair of struggling figures, but I couldn't get a lock on Ellery in my current condition, and I was too afraid I would take out the inspector by mistake. Blood pumped in my ears. I'd been in plenty of scrapes during my time on the force, but never had I felt so helpless. The inspector managed to thrust Ellery away from him for a few seconds, so that the old man stumbled back to the lip of the cliff, his arms swinging in a pinwheel. I pointed my gun at him, trying to squeeze out a bullet before the creature could get his balance again. But he was too late. His jaw was unhinging, and he was lunging at the inspector, eyes gleaming, claws extended. Ellery staggered backward, 2 fleshy red holes appearing in his chest. Silver goo dripped from the wounds and into the knee-high grass. I turned to see Marconi advancing on the old man, her gun drawn. Ellery bellowed at her, the throaty, tortured yell of an angry animal. She fired again and again, each shot driving him back just a little further, until finally he stepped backwards and slipped off the edge of the cliff. His scream was shrill enough to make my eardrums bleed. It lowered in volume as he plummeted toward the forest floor, then cut off suddenly in a choked cry of agony. The ground gave the slightest of trembles. Then a sigh escaped into the night, as if the earth itself had let out one loud, miserable gasp of breath. I got unsteadily to my feet and limped across the yard toward Marconi. I'd seen her take down guys twice her size without flinching, but when she lowered her gun, her hands were visibly shaking. "What the hell was that, Hannigan?" she shouted. "The investigation was a bust," the inspector replied. I jumped. I'd been so focused on reaching Marconi that I hadn't heard him approach. Mr. Pickett resisted our questioning and became violent, and was unfortunately killed when he tried to assault Detective Hannigan. It's unlikely he had anything to do with the recent deaths. We should return to the station and go back to the drawing board on this one. Marconi frowned at him. I knew she wouldn't buy it. Marconi was a massive skeptic, but she also believed her own eyes, and she'd seen the thing Ellery had become. There was no way she could have missed that guttural scream. It still hung in the air, like the static that pricks up the hairs on your arms right before a thunderstorm. "Okay, fine," she said at last. She glanced between the two of us, her eyes narrowed. "I'll play along for now. But someday, Hannigan, you're going to tell me exactly what the fuck happened tonight." I lifted a hand to my ear and felt a damp spot just below the earlobe. I drew back my bloody hand and stared at it for a few moments in the moonlight. Then I looked up at the inspector. The face hidden beneath his fog of cigar smoke was dark and unreadable. "I'd like to know that too," I said. The next evening, I was driving through a dense patch of forest on my way to patrol in the lower glade. It had rained that night. Clouds of mist billowed up from the road and swept over my cruiser, looking for all the world like a wave of swampy spirits. I turned on my high beams and gave the windshield a few wipes to clear away the drizzle. A particularly dense cloud washed over my car, and when it cleared, the inspector was waiting for me on the edge of the forest. I almost drove right past him. Slamming my foot on the brakes, I yanked the wheel to the right, tires splashing through the puddles that lined the uneven stretch of street. I climbed out of the cruiser and stood across from him, light raindrops still pattering on the roof of my car. Neither of us spoke for some time. His fedora was low enough to hide his eyes, and the tip of his cigar still smoldered, even in this damp weather. "Are you going to tell me what actually happened last night?" I asked. The inspector blew out a single smoke ring. "I need to show you something," he replied. And then the inspector wavered. I'm not sure how else to describe it. Nothing about his outward appearance changed, but it looked as if his body had been hollowed out, like a doll or a puppet, and there was something much larger encompassing it, something unseen pulling the strings. The illusion, whatever it was, lasted no more than a few seconds. He was just the inspector again. Tendrils of steam escaped from his cigar and mingled with the misty air. "You're not human," I said. The words felt strange coming out of my mouth, but they also felt right. "You're like that thing we fought up in Skokomish Bluffs." "I'm not a parasite," he replied. He didn't sound offended, just a bit sad. I could have tried to argue with him, with the rational side of me that knew he must be lying. But Sherlock Holmes was right. I'd glimpsed the improbable that night on the bluffs, and it may have thrown askew everything I thought I knew about the world, but it was the truth. There was no point trying to deny what my own eyes had seen. Did that scare me? Of course it did. The foundations of my reality had grown shaky, and part of me was still clamoring for that one sane foothold. But sometimes rationality can only take you so far. "Why do all this?" I asked him. "We must be, I don't know, like animals to you. Or talkative bacteria. Why bother going through all this effort to help us?" The inspector looked away from me, his hidden eyes staring off into the mist. The tip of Mount Palmer floated in the midst of it all, crags piercing the clouds. It could have been some eldritch beast loping through the fog. "Reality. All the stuff you see around you, and all the stuff you don't. It's huge. There are beings out there with shapes and sizes you couldn't even begin to fathom. And those with any sort of sentience look down on you people like protozoa. You're specks in a petri dish, bits of dim light that aren't worth the effort to snuff. He looked down at his hand and flexed his slender fingers, as if he was still unused to his borrowed shape. But not to me, he said. I look at humans and see honor, love, loyalty so strong you would take a bullet for the ones you trust. Archaic values to some of my kind, but I think they're worth protecting. Maybe that's naive of me, but I don't think so. He took this cigar from his mouth and tapped it against the side of his trench coat. Flecks of ash trickled from the tip and vanished into the soggy ground. So in some ways, you're right, he said. You're small, but you're not insignificant. Don't ever forget that. The sound of his voice gave way to crickets and the ever-present rustling of the trees. I stared up again at Mount Palmer, thinking of the odd weather patterns, the missing chickens, the noises in the woods, the countless unsolved cases we had buried back at the station. It's the Neverglades, isn't it? I said. There's something about this place. Something that brings all the strangeness to the surface. He pondered the question for a moment. In most parts of the world, beings like me keep to ourselves. We stay behind the veil and don't bother getting involved with humans. But the veil is thin here. There's a rip in reality, if you will. And sometimes things like Ellery slip through. Mindless, hungry things. And if more of them get through? I asked, turning to him. How do I know you've got my back? The inspector smiled. He may not have been one of us, but that one gesture seemed so genuine, so human, that I half wondered if we were rubbing off on him. I told you before, I go where I'm needed, he said. When the time comes, you'll know exactly where to find me. He tipped his hat to me, drops of rain rolling down the brim. Then he took a step backward into the forest. The trees shifted around him, their branches sweeping in like leafy arms to enfold his silhouette. I watched as his body shrank away and became one with the darkness. Soon there was nothing left of the inspector but the glowing tip of his cigar. It pulsed like a tiny firefly, bobbing its way through the trees. Then the mist settled in around me, cold and heavy, and I found myself alone on that barren stretch of highway. Hey everyone, thanks for listening to today's video. If you like what you heard, feel free to leave a comment below, and please subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already. If you'd like to support the channel even further, I highly encourage picking up a copy of the Neverglades books, which are all available on Amazon right now. Or, please consider donating to my Patreon account at the link provided. Hope you're having a wonderful day, and as always, don't forget to stay weird.